And we're back. Hello, darling.
Hello.
And I made a dreadful mistake at the end of the last video because I said we'd be doing the last part of the Major Arcana and I'd forgotten we hadn't done the middle row. So, welcome to everyone who's watching. We're actually covering the second part of the Major Arcana from the Healing Light Tarot today. So we'll be covering cards from number 8, Strength, through to number 14, Temperance. So we're actually going to start off with the Strength card, which I think is one of the most interesting in this deck, isn't it? Because it's certainly one of the most different from the traditional. So, yeah.
And it's one that when I've read with your deck for other people, it's one that they often comment on because it's not it's not a complete translation of the standard strength cards. But what I love about it is that it has that sort of Atlas-esque quality to it. But I love the fact that you've kept the silhouettes are obviously female, so you keep that female persona in from the original card, and then this planetary solar ball that is the lion. I mean, the whole thing exudes literally strength. It just, all of the symbology and associations are all things you would, associate with strength. Both positives and negatives. But I just think it's one of those cards that it's one of them ones. If it comes out in a reading, you're just like, oh yeah, it doesn't really matter what any of the other cards say because you've got strength. That's
fine. It's funny because I had a really clear vision of this, and it caught me off guard because it was one of those kind of bits of inspiration that just, I don't know, a light bulb went on in my head. Oh, we've got another visitor.
We've got Luna again.
She's quite apt. But I kind of had this vision of a female Atlas. And I mean, obviously I wanted the figure in the card to be female. There are, traditional older strength cards that show Hercules sort of battering the lion with his club, which is fine, but it's kind of not what I wanted to say. But I kind of had this vision of a female Atlas. And when I tried it, it just didn't quite work. So I kind of wanted a sphere of lion energy, of fire energy, just crackling, and a sense of her, like, all of the exertion to keep that lifted, because that's kind of how I see the sort of internal strength that the strength card talks about. It's almost like containing and channeling all of that inner fire, or keeping it restrained or keeping it contained, because when I tried it, it just didn't quite work. And then I sort of thought, I'm going to mirror her so that there's two of them. And when I did that, all of a sudden it really did just work for me, because I thought, yeah, there is that kind of almost like conscious and unconscious aspect. Passive strength, active strength, inner strength, outer strength. And that's sort of what I wanted to say. But it is very much about, this is what's in all of us. This is in every human being. But it's actually how we contain it, how we channel it, how we sort of harness it in a way that is the most important thing for me. So, this is all crackling fire energy, but there's sort of the bottom of the card, it's sort of green light and green energy to show that she's kind of earthed and rooted as well. But
I think it's interesting the use of the two silhouettes. I know you mentioned obviously like mirroring and stuff like that, but I often find that the strength card can often relay about us sort of having the strength to do things by ourselves, and yet actually this can sort of say, actually don't be afraid to ask for help. Share the burden. You don't have to weather it all entirely by yourself. There's no weakness in asking for assistance.
No, it's just part of being alive, isn't it? And that again, I think that's another really valid aspect of this card. But the other thing here is that the mandala is each of these women has their own sphere, but actually it's the overlapping of those spheres that creates the unity and that creates the strength.
So cooperation.
Cooperation.
Yeah.
So there, I was again very happy with how that turned out. I didn't know whether it would work, but it's kind of lovely to hear that it gets good feedback. That's even better again, you know.
Yeah.
So, okay, now this is more simpler and a little bit more peaceful. The Hermit.
I like the Hermit in most decks.
Yeah.
But I quite like yours because you initially have done away with the sort of side-on profile, of this, of the Rider-Waite one, and yet you can't quite make out whether this guy is facing towards you or away from you.
Yeah.
But there's a simplicity to this card. I mean, I suppose the Hermit's quite a simple card anyway. Even in the Rider-Waite, it's pretty much just the old figure with his staff and his lantern. That's pretty much it. But with your one, you've kind of encapsulated that, but then you've got this. It's like a mixture between sort of light play on clouds, but also like aurora effects and and stars. The mandala is there, but it's almost shimmering in like blue flame. Yeah, it's I don't know. There's just something really peaceful, and I don't know. I think I just want to move in and live in there.
I'm really glad you said that, because that's what I wanted to achieve. I mean, don't get me wrong. I love the traditional side-on depictions of the Hermit, but I wanted to be looking up at him on the peak, because he's kind of where we want to be. So
I've just suddenly seen that now you just mentioned it. Yeah,
I want the viewer's perspective to be almost there, but not quite. He's where we want to be. And one of the things I love about playing with silhouettes is exactly what you said. It's the ambiguity. You can't tell whether you're looking at this guy straight on or whether you're looking at him from behind. He can be facing whatever direction you want him to be. He can be looking out beyond at what you can't see. He could be looking down at you. He could be looking out at where you've just come from.
Yeah.
And that, again, that was a very deliberate ambiguity with this card. I picked a pose that would allow it to be neither one thing nor the other. So you can kind of close your eyes and project your own reality onto that. Otherwise, he's quite traditional. The lamp is traditional, and you can see
the
Star of David, the six-pointed star. So the kind of, again, it's a kind of unity and balance thing. The downward triangle of water is overlaid with the upward triangle of fire. So it's kind of showing that. I mean, again, we've talked about the sort of clashing of fire and water in several of the other cards, but here they're just sort of in perfect unity. And again, that kind of feeds into the sense of calm with the Hermit. He's just in general, he is in, the peak of that mountain is mandala space. It's having reached that peak, he is in that sort of solitude, but also that stillness and that safe healing space. Because I mean, to me, that's what this card is about. One of the things that we as human beings fear most of all is very often is being on our own. But there's times when you just have to be, and actually, when being in solitude is actually the right thing, and it's the healing thing. But also, I mean, he's not in the dark. He's lighting his surroundings, which is something I love. He's almost lighting up the sky, which again is something I wanted. It's difficult to gauge his scale, but this is a very safe place. It's very high. It's probably very cold, but it's safe.
Yes.
It's kind of what I love about the Hermit is there's just this kind of sense of everything being exactly where it should be. There's times when withdrawal and solitude are exactly what you need.
Yeah.
And of all the cards, this one is the exemplar of that. It's the archetype of solitude, isn't it? As all the major arcana are higher archetypes. This is the archetype of aloneness, in its positive sense. Don't know, tip it upside down. That's isolation, maybe.
It's sort of like agoraphobic, sort of don't want to associate with anybody, overprotective for protective's sake. You it's almost that you're missing out through the fear of trying almost.
Exactly.
I don't know, something about turning this one on its head gives it more of a subterranean feel than standing on a peak. It almost seems like now he's in a cave,
trapped in the underworld.
Yeah.
It's not always an easy card to face. I find him reassuring, but there are times when I also find him quite threatening because I precisely do fear being alone. Whereas I think in a way that I'm glad you said there was something inviting here, because it kind of, I would like him to just say it's okay.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was saying about it being, it's interesting because you say like you fear being alone, and I found it inviting because more often than not I like to be on my own. That's my default. So it's interesting that we can both see different aspects in the same thing.
It is, and that's, again, it kind of highlights the fact that these archetypes are bigger than any one of us. We own, I think, with all of the, I think not just with the minor arcana, the major arcana, but also with the minor arcana cards. I mean, there's numerous lifetimes worth of wisdom in all of these images. The pattern of the tarot contains generation upon generations worth of accumulated wisdom, and as we each come to these cards individually, we will only get a glimpse of a fraction of what each of these cards contains, I think. But then that's also the fun, because we kind of each glimpse. Sometimes we glimpse the same fractions, other times we glimpse different ones, and we'll never stop plumbing the depths of these. We could spend a lifetime and we'll only scratch the surface. But it's why we love it, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, my Wheel of Fortune.
Wheel of Fortune. I quite like this one because there are a couple of things that sort of stand out to me about it. Is that because we mentioned in the cups about the use of the ballet silhouette around the outside, and now I don't know what they're called, but there are those they're like a cyclical flick book of an image and once it goes round you see it moving, and I don't know what they're called, but also the starbursts rays that come out of that also make it look akin to a roulette wheel.
That was deliberate.
And then obviously you've got this text in the back, the doctrine of chances, which is quite
this image started out originally as part of an aborted Oracle deck. I started an Oracle deck in about 2010 with a friend, and we kind of just ran out of steam. It was a great concept, but we both ran out of steam, and I don't think either of us would have been ready to actually do it justice. But there was a couple of images that I created, and I thought I don't want those to go to waste. And the basics of this image was called it was the card of chance in that project. So I adapted it, but he sort of found this wonderful scan of I think it was a vintage 16th or 17th century text. And we just used the title page, The Doctrine of Chance. We kind of wanted it ghosted into the image, but it was also, I kind of created these sort of cosmic spokes, and it was very much to give it the feel of a spinning roulette wheel. In the center of the wheel, there is sort of you can see it's a pool, and a single drop has basically caused a splash in the pool. So again, that the fact that a single drop can cause ripples that echo out across time. Exactly. That's the sort of precariousness of the Wheel of Fortune. And then around, I kind of wanted the sort of angelic dancers. I wanted to show the wheel of change, the wheel of life.
And I've only just noticed that you've got the moon phases as well. I've literally never noticed that before.
It's phases of the moon. So basically, it's anything to do with cyclical change, anything to do with chance. Because this is the paradox of the Wheel of Fortune, isn't it? I mean, in medieval times, I don't know what the actual literal term would have been, but in medieval English, the goddess Fortune was referred very unceremoniously to as the blind bitch, because she was she was a figure of mythology and folklore, but she was not a popular figure.
No.
Because it was that whole idea of like completely blind, dispassionate, just twist the wheel on a whim, and people's lives rise or fall. But it's that weird sort of paradox of you have that seemingly random aspect to fortune's wheel turning, but then at the end of the day, the turn of a wheel can only ever be cyclical. So what goes around comes around, whichever way you go. So I kind of wanted to show that paradox, but also on a kind of more, not on a physical level. This is kind of more cosmic and, more figurative. So everything sort of emanates out from that one drop, but it's a roulette wheel. It's Fortuna's wheel. It's the wheel of the month, the cycles of the moon. It's the doctrine of change. So it's not quite what I expected to create, but it just felt right. And
there's definitely something about the way it has the way it's come together that it so obviously represents the Wheel of Fortune, but yet there is a uniqueness to it that it is almost especially where the mandala is placed on that sort of droplet it's sort of taking the chance on the on the unknown, because you don't know necessarily how far the ripples are going to go, whether you're going to be coming out on the top or the bottom. But as we've mentioned in other cards about stagnation and not moving forward through fear and things like that, this is one of those ones. You can't really escape it, and you certainly can't turn the wheel back. It only really goes in one direction.
That's right. And it's also as well, we've talked about how the sort of blind goddess Fortune, is sort of demonized in folklore for very understandable reason. But when you think about it, one of the reasons I wanted the sort of the droplet at the center of the mandala, because change is healing and change is inevitable. The whole, that's probably one of the most basic principles of the universe. Nothing stands still, either temporarily or physically. So, it's threatening and it's frightening, but we might as well embrace it because it's the natural law. Change is the natural law.
Yeah.
I think the more I thought about this, it kind of really gave me a new appreciation for this archetype. To me, it's one of the most powerful of the majors, in its concept and in its scope. I do love the Wheel of Fortune as a card, and I'm always fascinated to see how other artists interpret it, because it very often sort of gets some of the most creative. I mean, one of my big inspirations for this was the Robin Wood Tarot, because she literally showed the Wheel of Fortune as a roulette wheel, but rather than having numbers, each segment of the roulette wheel showed a person in a different state of happiness or distress. And the ball bearing was spinning round. You didn't know where it was going to land. And it was, to me, it was just one of the loveliest and most perilous depictions of the card I'd ever seen. And it's still to this day, that her version of the Wheel of Fortune really haunts me. I love the Swiss 1JJ version because you actually see the blind goddess cranking the wheel. But actually, if you look closely, you've got this couple sat on the top of the wheel. The wheel's on the edge of a cliff, so when they fall off, they're not even going down the bottom of the wheel; they're going down the pit.
Going off the cliff.
And but it does it. It's kind of it very often brings out the best in artists, I think. So that was great fun to do. So, and moving on to Justice, this was another one that I salvaged from the old Oracle deck project. Because it wasn't like a justice card per se, but we wanted to show the principle of justice. And there we go. I've changed the colours from the original concept, but one of the things that I did keep was the cogs, because I've kind of shown justice traditionally between the two pillars. But I wanted to show her in a garden, but these aren't flowers, they're cogs. And again, I kind of wanted a sense of justice is something, it's a man-made concept. It's well, no, it's not. It's a universal concept, but it's put into practice in a man-made practical way. And I kind of wanted to show the wheels of justice and the cogs of justice turning.
Yeah, I think man's justice is an artificial interpretation, whereas obviously natural justice, Themis, the original personification of it, is more to do with the natural order of things, and that kind of self-regulates, whereas we, I don't know, we seem just to like to interfere in everything, and it doesn't always necessarily run like clockwork. And it took me a while to figure out the cogs, I will admit, when I first came across this card. But then when I started to look, and I could see, and then behind the cogs, you could see the foliage and things like that. And then I kind of got it, and it's interesting as well. Like the scales happen to have, you've got one white and one black, in the negative aspect, that makes, again, that sort of balance of right and wrong and
duality.
Yeah.
And also, to be perfectly honest, it's a brutal practicality when you're working in silhouette, because it's the only way I could get the other pan to show up. But actually, it worked, because it really made me think about what the scales really were. And as you say, it is that duality, right and wrong, just and unjust. The fact that justice is a constant practical weighing of opposites. What I did want to do here is my initial instinct was to put the scales in the mandala, and I realized, no, that's not ultimately where justice comes from. The scales are the measuring tool, but ultimately justice is dispensed through decision, and that comes from the head. So the mandala basically surrounds the figure of justice's crown in chakra, There's a star in her crown that denotes that, and that's the center of the mandala. And justice when dispensed healthily is a very healing, is a very healing principle. But at the same time, this is not natural justice. I think Crowley, with his adjustment card, focused on natural justice a lot more, because I think the concept behind the Thoth Tarot wasn't really coming from a place of moral constructs. It was more coming from a place of natural law, wasn't it? I think that's my instinct anyway. Whereas I kind of do, in this instance, I really preferred to go with just the more traditional issue of justice as one of the cardinal virtues. But at the same time, I think the cogs, to me, also, it kind of represented a rational process. We often talk about the cogs turning, and for justice to be dispensed properly, there has to be a lot of rational weighing up and analyzing, and that's also what the cogs were for me. So there's a kind of canopy of greenery, but the flowers are cogs. And also when you look down here, there are more cogs in the foliage here. So it's very much it's a deceptive garden. That's what I wanted to create.
Yeah.
But then again,
I think looking at it at the minute, for me, I'm actually realizing that there's so much I've missed so far, in the previous times of looking at it. And I'm actually sort of, I'm kind of getting drawn back into it again, thinking, actually, I didn't notice that last time and this last time. And there's parallels to be drawn from a lot of previous cards, because in a way she's holding the scales similarly to the way the hermit holds his lamp. You can see sort of like almost two pillars behind her, so that's an echo back to the high priestess. And weirdly, I don't know whether it's intentional or not, but the crown is a bit lopsided, or it seems lopsided to me. So is that kind of, it's not necessarily about just ruling for ruling justice's sake. Sometimes there is corruption, there is I can't think of the word now, but that sense of, just because it's the crown justice or whatever, doesn't necessarily mean it's the right justice.
I haven't thought about that, because I went with the tilt of her head when I positioned the crown. But you're right, because it's human justice is never perfect. There is a principle of divine justice, but that's kind of what we aspire to, but we're never going to get there. So actually, that's a really interesting take on it. I wouldn't have thought. And yeah, you're right. I mean, she's not perfect. So that was one of the more interesting cards to do, but it was interesting because I was starting with part of a pre-existent image and then kind of having to, it was an image and a concept that was too good to lose, but at the same time, it had to evolve to be part of this deck. So I am kind of quite proud of that one. I do like it. So the Hangman.
Yeah, I quite like Hangman again as a general rule.
Yes.
And yet again, you kind of managed to almost streamline and simplify this down to sort of just, I don't know, just down to the basics without losing anything.
You know what I love? You know, when you get the sort of, say, like the Golden Dawn depictions of the Hangman, and they really emphasize the water aspect. You know, because in modern decks, I mean, he's associated with Neptune. I mean, in sort of earlier decks before Neptune as a planet was discovered, it was just associated with the element of water, wasn't it? And I kind of wanted to show that watery aspect. So I love the Crowley deck. Is quite, the Crowley Hangman I love because it's quite watery. I love the sort of Golden Dawn depictions, but I wanted a sense of him being underwater, part of the water here.
Yeah.
I mean, interestingly, you don't see it on, sort of earlier versions of the Hangman, but I mean, from Weight onwards, he's given a halo. But again, that just naturally became the mandala here. Because, I mean, for me, it's very much about inversion, and it's also, there are times when you kind of have to relinquish control. I mean, this guy's hanging by 1 foot. He's not going anywhere. He can't go anywhere. I mean, earlier versions of the card, traditionally, he was also known as the traitor. I mean, this is actually a medieval form of punishment called bafflement, where people were basically hung by their foot and all the blood would rush to their head and they'd eventually die. So it's quite a sinister card on one level. Weight turned him almost into a suffering saint who's found serenity. To me, there's a bit of everything in here. I kind of see this as when it is the sort of archetype of inversion, when, life is turned upside down or perspectives are turned upside down and you can see things from a different perspective. But it's also, he doesn't have any control. And to find any level of peace, he just has to give himself in, and the serenity is in the head. So the halo became the mandala for me. He's kind of, what you can't see here is a gallows, because I kind of created this. He's almost hanging in a sphere, and his lines up with that. But yeah, this is kind of one of my more ambiguous ones from the majors.
But I think that's part of the nature of the Hangman is the ambiguity. I can't even speak. The ambiguity is there's so many questions that can come from just looking at the card to think, right, well, why is he hanging upside down? Who put him upside down? Why hasn't anybody let him down? Or, how did he get up there? There's so many.
There's a lot, isn't there?
Answered questions. And I think when artists sort of put too much into the actual image, it loses some of that. Whereas by literally just an inverted silhouette, it kind of that's just everything. Well, it's everything in the card without actually telling you anything. And I think this is probably one of those cards that when it comes up requires a lot more thought before you sort of interpret it. And it's very much about the other cards that are in play, and obviously the position that this one's particularly come out of. And obviously, as you mentioned before, I find it is a card of perspective, but I also find it's one of those ones that it's very much can represent going inside and looking around inside yourself, which in a way it feel like an inversion. Actually going in and trying to sort of, I don't know, encounter and deal with like the shadow self and things like that, I think can come out through the Hangman quite easily.
I think the body posture is something that I always found really enigmatic. And then, I mean, I think different people have different takes on it. But for me, what struck me was the figure of the number 4. You know, if you stand him up, he's forming a number 4, which, I mean, is numerically is a symbol of stability in numerology. You know, 4 square. Whereas you turn it upside down, and that stability is lost. You know, so actually his body posture is again is a kind of inversion of stability, and yet there's peace in it. It is as if there's a kind of rightness in, you know, in that inversion. It's just, again, I find this probably the most enigmatic of all the cards.
Yeah,
there aren't straightforward answers with the Hangman, but then when your world gets tipped upside down, and you have to see it from a different perspective, there are very rarely black and white answers, aren't there? So it's kind of, you can live with the ambiguity in the image itself for that very reason.
Yeah, I think, like I say, the longer you look at it, the more you get drawn in and start. I think that's the thing. You start to ask yourself the questions rather than looking for the answers. You start to actually consider what the questions are. And that all sort of comes out. And I think that's where that enlightenment from the halo and the mandala comes from then, is that sometimes it isn't about the answers, it's the questions. Yeah,
it is. Shall we move on to number 13?
Yes, because I think this chap's rather cute, actually.
I
think he's quite cute.
This is unashamed. This is my homage to my first tarot deck, because the skeleton figure on here is direct. I directly based him on the skeleton from the 1JJ Swiss Tarot, which was the very first deck I bought when I was 13. And it's funny, don't get me wrong, I love more complex depictions of the death card. I particularly love Waite and Smith's depiction of, you know, the sort of the skeleton in the suit of armor, the banner with the pale rose, you know, the figures on the card. That is real narrative storytelling, and it's very, very, very powerful. But I always loved the sort of traditional death cards, sometimes where they just show the skeleton as the Grim Reaper, which is basically what the 1JJ does. And it's kind of my archetypal death card because it was my first. And what I did was I spent a day basically just drawing around a scan of the Swiss 1JJ skeleton in my computer and turning him into a silhouette. And then I sort of added in the facial features as gaps, but then I warped him and stretched him.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, isn't it? It's that distortion that just gives it something else. Because, like, you know, whether we're talking literal or figurative death, nobody wants to look at it because there is something that is anathema to us to even consider it. And as much as I sit there and think, oh yeah, he's quite cute because he looks like a little happy, smiley Grim Reaper, when you actually look past that and you start to consider the warped nature of it, that's when the unsettling bit comes into it. Because it's like, yeah, he's grinning at me and he's all gangly and not right, and you know that's where the troublesome elements about, you know, the idea of death, especially, you know, for tarot newbies who will see this and go, oh my god, it's the death card. You know, it's definitely one of those ones that, again, just make you stop and think. And yet actually I think death, it's the death has the knowing smile, because they know that whether it's, you know, the end of one thing, beginning of another, literal, figurative, whatever, they know that that's all going to happen one way or another. And it's almost that they're bemused by our reaction or resistance to it, as if that we ever have a choice, because we don't. Not really.
We don't have a choice, but also when you think as well, when this figure originated, you know, in the tarot in Renaissance times, this figure had far more potency and fear behind it. You know, living in a world without antibiotics, without modern medicine, without modern drugs, you know, where basically medicine was herbal medicine, no treatments for cancer, no treatments for any of the things that we take for granted now that are potentially survivable. This figure was on your shoulder really from when you were a child. Infant mortality. You know, the culture that created the concept of the Grim Reaper knew him intimately, and way more intimately than we do now.
Yeah,
you know,
he was walking the streets. You
he was
saw it
walking the street,
everywhere you went.
literally. You've only got to think of like the Black Death to think of how much of a close companion this figure would have been. And it's one of the reasons why I didn't feel that I needed to put anything else on the card. I think as a figure, you know, there are times when it's wonderful to see that archetype elaborated, and very rightly so. But there are also times when he just speaks for himself, and particularly that particular, you know, the death card I base this on. But interestingly, again, this started life in an earlier project, because after I finished the Quantum Tarot, Kay Stopford and I started work on a project that we were going to call what were we going to call it? It was basically a black and white tarot. The inspiration was film noir, but circumstances took over. Again, I just don't think we didn't have enough of a full concept for it to, you know, to really work. But there was a couple of images I created, and this was one of them that I knew I had to adapt. I mean, obviously the original was in black and white, so I colorized this. I added in a few more elements. But again, when it came to putting the mandala in, I just thought, yeah, death itself is the healing. Because much as we don't like this figure, you know, the universe relies on death to regenerate and to refresh. You know, death and rebirth are one and the same thing. So if we want new life, we also have to accept this. And the fact that, you know, in readings, nobody is ever going to try and predict physical death. Well, no ethical tarot reader will anyway. This is a metaphor, you know, beyond physical death. It's about the principle of death and rebirth that we all experience, whether it be metaphorically, physically, emotionally. You know, there are certain changes in life that are irreversible, and that's what he represents. That's why we fear him so much.
Yeah.
You know, there is the prospect of genuine loss when we encounter this figure. And yeah, I kind of thought nothing more need be said. He kind of speaks for himself.
Yeah.
But sometimes less is more. You know,
I really like that card. Just
I'm glad.
I don't know why specifically. There is just something about him. I think he's just a bit cheeky. But
so I'm really gratified to know that I provided you with a cuddly death card. Last card of this video, Temperance. Now, I'm really interested to know how you reacted to this, because again, I've not been very traditional with this.
Well, no, I was actually just about to say that it took me a little while to. I don't know. It wasn't that I didn't get on with it. It was just because it was so different. Because obviously, you know, it wasn't intrinsically what you came to expect through the Rider-Waite. But what I did start to learn to sort of accept about it was actually that the more you look, you find the nuances from the Rider-Waite has, and you've kind of almost got this. I kind of can't decide on what sort of mythic figure to sort of ascribe to him. Part of me sees him as a Promethean figure, and another part of me sees him sort of as like a Daedalus figure.
That's actually quite interesting.
But then when I think about the sort of the meeting of fire and water, which is kind of what this one represents, you know, Prometheus is the fire, Daedalus is kind of would be the water. And the fact that you've got the unity of those two elements, but you've kept them, like in the bottom of the card, you've kept the elemental symbols separate, rather than joining them together, say like how you would see it in the Hermit's star.
Yeah.
And yet there's just, it still carries that tranquil and sort of equilibrium of mutable transference, really. There's just something about it, again, that if this one comes out in a reading, you can kind of you can almost sort of take a breath and go, oh, thank God for that. It's not all necessarily
Yeah.
It's not all high drama, high octane, high emotion. It's like there is actually going to be a bit of calm and a bit of almost sensible sensible action. But yeah, I think it initially it was a bit of a shock to sort of see it and go, oh, that's not quite what I was expecting. But over time and through it coming through in readings, I've actually found that there's a lot more to it than you initially sort of take at surface value. But I'm quite interested to hear like how this came about.
I'm actually really glad that you've responded to it like that, because this was just so awkward to do. I had a couple of false starts and it just wasn't working. And I couldn't get it right in silhouette. It was just not going to work for me. And I ended up improvising this and then looking at it. And then all of a sudden you get to a certain stage, you think it's where it should be. It's not what I intended to create. But I kind of realized that what mattered for me was the meeting and the confluence of fire and water. And you're right, I very deliberately didn't want the star, because I took my lead from the cups, because I realized there's this constant pouring backwards and forwards from the cups. It's that fluid motion is always, that's never, that's not a single process. That's a constant, the liquid has to be tempered all the time. So I kind of had this vision in the end of the cups being held aloft and then like a rainbow of liquid jumping from one to the other and vice versa, rather than him actively pouring. But there is a fire sphere and there's a water sphere, and it's actually that place of overlapping where you get temperance, because temperance is not actually, it's about blending, but it's also about mixing, and that mixing process is not always an easy one. So it's like he emerges out of that confluence, the temperance angel emerges from that confluence. Some of the symbolism in here is traditional in that, if you look at a Wade Smith temperance, you'll see the fire triangle on his breast. There is the sun symbol in that card. But I tell you what did inspire me with this one is I passionately love Hermann Heindel's tarot. And in his tarot, the card is called Alchemy, and it's much more of an abstract painting. But you've got like if the card is diagonally divided, one portion is in watery colors, the other is in fire. But then, you've got in the sort of water section, you've got like a sphere of fire and vice versa. A sphere of water in the fire section, and there's all these kind of odd little overlappings and juxtapositions which make it an intriguing card. And that was my starting point, but I kind of wanted to create something that was more traditionally angelic, but it's that merging of the two. And I love this card. If justice is the masculine principle of balance, and it's dealing with sort of rational balance and mental balance, I've always seen temperance as the feminine principle, because it's more balance of the emotion, balance of the humors, balance of the elements. It's kind of more, it's the natural order, whereas to me, justice is the rational order. So it's one of my favorite cards from the major arcana. It took me a long time to appreciate it, but to me, temperance is kind of one of the most intriguing ones. And just, again, I love what different artists do with it. The Mythic Tarot, they portrayed temperance as the goddess Iris. So you've got the rainbows as well, which again is an incredible, metaphor for blending and splitting.
Well, that again is fire and water, isn't it? It's the sun's light against water droplets becomes rainbows.
Yeah, lovely card. And one that you just as an archetype, I don't think we would ever finish plumbing the depths of. And I love it, like you, when it comes in a reading, you kind of just get this sense of balance, equilibrium. Things will be all right. And then it's like, well, we don't talk about that.
We don't talk about that. That's one of the few occasions where when it's like that, we don't talk about it. We don't want it to come out looking like that. Because I mean, literally, that is just yeah. That no, you don't even need to say it. You know full well that if it came out like
It's
that,
one of those you just look and say, right, moving swiftly on.
Yeah, it's just like, yeah, well, yeah. What's the next card gonna do?
Oh, darling, that's the end of this video. Thank you so much. And thank you for everyone who's watched. And I can confidently and correctly tell you that the next video we do will be the final one in the series. And we will be covering the last 7 cards of the Major Arcana, from the Devil card, number 15, through to the World. So hope you've enjoyed this and that you'll join us next time. Thanks so much.